Burn every mirror in Hawthorne Hall before dawn, and leave no silver bright enough to remember my face." The command moved through the great house like a winter draft, whispered from footman to maid, from kitchen stair to servants' corridor, until even the old clocks seemed to tick more softly. Duke Ethan Hawthorne stood at the center of the marble entrance hall, his tall figure cut in black against the trembling candlelight, while rain struck the high windows with the patience of 1,000 small fingers. One by one, the servants carried the mirrors down from the walls. Tall gilded mirrors from the ballroom, narrow dressing mirrors from the guest chambers, a round Venetian glass from the blue parlor that had reflected 3 generations of Hawthornes before it reflected him. No one looked at the Duke as they passed. They had learned not to. They kept their eyes on the floor, on the brass candlesticks, on the dark runner beneath their shoes, anywhere but the left side of his face, where the scar disappeared beneath his collar like a secret the world had not been polite enough to forget. Ethan watched them obey with the stillness of a man carved from grief. He wore no bandage now. He had refused one years ago. Let society have its whispers. Let distant cousins call him ruined over tea. Let painted women in bright rooms lower their fans and pretend not to stare. He had survived all that. What he had not survived was the mirror in his mother's chamber, the small silver one with lilies engraved around the handle, the one she had once held up to him when he was a boy of 6 and told him that a gentleman must look himself in the eye before he looked upon the world. That mirror had shown him the truth tonight, not merely the scar, but the hatred that had grown around it. "Your Grace," Mr. Whitaker, the butler, said carefully, "that is the last of them." Ethan turned. 2 footmen held the silver hand mirror between them as if it were a holy relic or a loaded pistol. His jaw tightened. "Take it to the courtyard with the rest." A soft sound came from the shadows near the west passage, too small to be disobedience, too quiet to be fear. Ethan's eyes cut toward it. A young servant girl stood there with a folded linen cloth in her hands. She was new. Clara Bennett, he recalled after a moment, though he had approved her hiring without caring to remember her face. She was pale from the cold corridor, her brown hair pinned simply beneath a white cap, her plain gray dress damp at the hem from some errand through the rain. Unlike the others, she did not drop her gaze quickly enough. "Did I give you permission to watch me?" Ethan asked. The hall seemed to shrink around his voice. Clara lowered her eyes then, but not with terror. With thought. "No, Your Grace." "Then leave." She should have gone. Any sensible servant would have vanished behind the nearest door and thanked Providence for the chance. Instead, her fingers tightened around the linen. "The mirror bears your mother's initials." The footman froze. Mr. Whitaker closed his eyes as though bracing for thunder. Ethan descended 1 step, then another. Candlelight caught the scar along his cheek, turning it pale as old marble. "What did you say?" Clara's throat moved, but her voice remained steady. "E, H, and M, H, Your Grace. The engraving is not only ornament. It is remembrance." For a long moment, no one breathed. Outside, rain ran down the glass in silver veins. Ethan looked from the girl to the mirror, and something old and unwelcome stirred beneath the armor of his anger. Memory. His mother's gloved hand. Her lavender perfume. Her laugh in a room before fire had taken laughter from the house. He hated Clara Bennett for noticing. He hated her more for being right. "You are dismissed from service," he said coldly. "You will be gone by morning." At last, her composure faltered, but only in the smallest way, a brief whitening of her knuckles around the linen cloth. She did not weep. She did not plead. "Very well, Your Grace." Then she turned, walked to the footmen, and gently took the silver mirror from their uncertain hands. "But if I am to leave by morning, allow me 1 hour first. There is a stable boy with fever in the north wing, and no one has mended his coat." Ethan stared at her, unable to decide whether he had been insulted or quietly judged. A servant girl with nothing had asked a condemned man for mercy on behalf of someone poorer than herself. 1 hour, he said at last, each word edged with ice. Clara curtsied, holding his mother's mirror against the linen as if it still deserved tenderness. She passed him without flinching. And for the first time in 3 years, Ethan Hawthorne wondered if someone had looked at him and seen something other than the wound. Clara Bennett left the entrance hall with the silver mirror wrapped in linen and the weight of dismissal resting quietly on her shoulders. She did not hurry. Hawthorne Hall punished haste. Its corridors were long, narrow, and darkly paneled, with portraits turned toward the walls and sconces burning low, as if the house itself had learned to hide its face. Behind her, the servants resumed their work in trembling silence, carrying the last mirrors toward the courtyard where rain waited to swallow their shine. Ahead of her, beyond the servants' staircase and the cold passage that led toward the north wing, a boy coughed behind a half-closed door. His name was Thomas Reed. He was 12 years old, small for his age, and determined to pretend he was not ill because stable boys who became burdens were easily replaced. Clara knew that fear. She had lived beside it most of her life. She entered the narrow room where he sat wrapped in a thin blanket, his boots lined beneath the bed with military precision, though one sole had nearly come loose. A single candle stood on a crate beside him. Its flame bent each time the wind found a crack in the stone. "Miss Bennet," Thomas whispered, trying to sit straighter. "You should not be here." Mrs. Hale said his grace is in a temper. Clara placed the linen-wrapped mirror carefully beneath the chair, out of sight. "His grace has given me 1 hour." "For what?" "For doing what should already have been done." She took his coat from the peg. The wool was worn thin at the elbows, torn along one seam, and damp with the smell of horses, rain, and honest work. From the small pocket of her apron, Clara drew a needle, dark thread, and a folded scrap of flannel she had saved from an old curtain. Her hands moved with calm purpose, stitch by stitch, breath by breath. Thomas watched her as if she were performing some act of dangerous kindness. "Are you truly leaving in the morning?" he asked. Clara did not look up. "That appears to be the Duke's wish." "Because of the mirror?" "Because I spoke when silence would have been safer." Thomas swallowed. "My mother used to say safe silence can cost more than loud trouble." Clara's needle paused. For one fragile second, her father's voice seemed to return to her from a poorer room, a warmer room, a room that no longer existed. Dr. Samuel Bennet had once told her the same thing, though in different words. "A truthful mouth may go hungry, Clara, but a false one starves the soul." Society had called him careless after the death of a wealthy woman he could not save. They had not cared that he had ridden 17 miles through sleet to reach her, or that he had spent his last dollar buying medicine for the poor. One accusation had ruined him. One drawing-room rumor had buried a good man alive long before the churchyard did. Clara pushed the memory down and resumed stitching. "Your mother was wise." "She was tired," Thomas said. "Mostly tired." Clara smiled faintly. "Wisdom often comes wearing tired eyes." Beyond the door, a shadow shifted. Neither Clara nor the boy saw it at first. Duke Ethan Hawthorne stood in the passage, his gloved hand resting against the carved wall, having followed without intending to follow, and stopped without meaning to listen. He should have returned to his study. He should have summoned Whitaker and ordered the girl's wages prepared. He should have felt nothing but irritation at her boldness. Instead, he stood in the dark like an intruder in his own house, watching a dismissed servant mend a stable boy's coat, as if the small task mattered more than her own future. Clara bent closer to the candle, its light soft against her white skin, her face composed but not empty. There was no performance in her kindness. No audience had been expected. That unsettled Ethan more than defiance would have. The world he knew performed virtue beneath chandeliers and practiced cruelty behind closed doors. Yet here, in a room no guest would ever enter, this girl gave her final hour not to pleading, but to repair. Thomas coughed again. Clara set the coat aside and touched the back of her fingers to his forehead with the gentleness of someone who had learned care from loss. "You need broth, dry socks, and no stable work tomorrow. Mr. Barnes will not allow it." "Then Mr. Barnes may discuss it with me before I depart." A sound almost escaped Ethan. Not laughter. Not quite. Something older and less familiar. Clara tied off the last stitch and held the coat up. It was not beautiful, but it would hold warmth. Thomas slipped his arms into it and closed his eyes as if wrapped in dignity itself. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara folded the remaining thread, then reached beneath the chair for the linen bundle. As she lifted it, the silver handle slipped partly free, catching one thin line of candlelight. Ethan saw his mother's initials flash in the dimness. Clara saw him in the doorway at the same moment. The boy stiffened. The air changed. Ethan stepped into the room, and the little candle seemed to shrink beneath his presence. "Your hour is not yet finished," he said. Clara rose slowly. "No, Your Grace." His gaze moved from the mended coat to the feverish boy, then to the mirror held against her plain gray dress. "Why keep it wrapped?" Clara answered carefully. "Because some things should not be thrown into rain simply because they have become difficult to look at." The words struck with unbearable softness. Ethan's jaw tightened, but no command came. For once, anger did not arrive quickly enough to save him. He looked at Thomas, at the repaired sleeve, at Clara's steady hands. Then he turned toward the corridor. "The boy will have broth sent up. Dry socks as well. He is excused from stable duty tomorrow." Thomas stared as if a cathedral window had opened in the wall. Clara lowered her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." Ethan paused at the threshold, his scarred profile half hidden by shadow. "Do not thank me yet, Miss Bennet. Morning has not come." Then he left them with the candle, the rain, and the silver mirror still unburned. Morning did not come gently to Hawthorne Hall. It crept through the rain-streaked windows in a colorless wash, touching the covered portraits, the empty spaces where mirrors had hung, and the marble floors still marked by the damp footprints of servants who had worked through the night. Clara Bennet stood in the laundry room before sunrise, folding her 2 plain dresses into the same small carpet bag she had carried into the house only 3 weeks before. She moved without complaint. A life spent depending on the mercy of others had taught her never to look surprised when mercy ended. Still, when her fingers brushed the linen bundle at the bottom of the bag, she paused. The silver hand mirror lay inside, wrapped as carefully as a letter from the dead. She had not meant to keep it. She had meant only to save it from rain until the Duke's anger cooled, if anger such as his could ever cool. The initials on its handle had stayed in her mind all night. E, H, and M, H. A son and a mother. A face and the woman who had once taught him not to fear looking at it. Somewhere above the laundry room, a bell rang once, low and formal. Clara closed the bag. In the servants' hall, Mrs. Hale waited with red-rimmed eyes and a mouth pressed tight against sympathy. Mr. Whittaker stood beside the long table, his black coat immaculate, his expression unreadable. "Miss Bennet," he said, "His Grace has requested that you bring the breakfast tray to the West Library before you depart." Mrs. Hale looked at him sharply. "That is irregular." "So is most of what occurred last night," Mr. Whittaker replied. Clara accepted the tray without question. Silver coffee pot. Toast untouched by warmth. 1 boiled egg. A folded newspaper from Albany, though the Duke rarely read newspapers now except to learn which people still spoke of him without permission. The walk to the West Library seemed longer than it had the day before. The walls remembered too much. 3 years earlier, those same corridors had glittered with visitors, music, and late summer flowers. Ethan Hawthorne had once filled them as if born to command admiration. He had been 29 then, broad-shouldered, quick-witted, and almost dangerously handsome, with dark hair that caught candlelight and gray eyes that made society mothers forgive arrogance when it wore a ducal title. At dinners in Newport and winter balls in New York, women had pretended to drop gloves near him. Men had sought his approval over brandy. Reporters wrote of his estate reforms, his charities, his horses, his perfect manners. Painters begged to capture his profile. He smiled in those portraits as if the future had already bowed. Then came the fire at Ashford Lodge. The official story said a lamp overturned during a storm. The newspapers praised his bravery and mourned his injury with polished phrases. They did not print how Vivian Monroe, his promised bride, stopped visiting after the bandages were removed. They did not print how she returned his letters unopened, then appeared at a spring reception on another gentleman's arm, pale with pity and careful not to say his name. They did not print that Ethan had stood before his dressing glass the night after and covered it with his own hands. By autumn, Hawthorne Hall had begun to close. First the ballroom, then the music room, then the east wing. One servant later whispered that the Duke had not disappeared from society because of his scar. He had disappeared because he had seen how quickly affection became embarrassment when beauty could no longer carry it. Clara knew none of this fully, not yet, but she felt its shape as she approached the library doors, the way one feels a storm before hearing thunder. "Enter," Ethan called before she knocked. He stood near the cold fireplace, dressed in black, his scar turned partly away from the light. On the desk lay the morning newspaper, unopened. Beside it rested a stack of wages sealed in an envelope. Clara placed the tray down. "Your breakfast, Your Grace." His gaze lowered to the carpetbag in her hand. Prepared to leave? Yes, Your Grace. And yet you still have something that belongs to this house. Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of the bag. Slowly, she withdrew the linen bundle and set it on the desk. The silver mirror gleamed softly as she unfolded it, not bright enough to accuse, only bright enough to remember. Ethan did not touch it. His face hardened, but his eyes changed first. Clara saw it then, the smallest fracture beneath the marble. Not vanity, not rage, grief. I meant no theft, she said. I know. The answer surprised them both. Rain whispered down the windows. Ethan looked at the mirror as if it were a door into a room he had nailed shut long ago. My mother carried that to every house we ever visited, he said at last. She believed a man should never enter the world without first knowing what he brought into it. Clara said nothing. Silence, when used kindly, could become a shelter. Ethan's hand hovered over the silver handle, then withdrew. She died before she could see what I became. Clara's voice was very soft. Perhaps she would have seen more than that. His eyes lifted to hers, sharp with warning, but the warning had come too late. Her words had already entered. For the first time, Ethan Hawthorne did not order her away. He only stood beside the mirror he could not face, while the servant girl he had dismissed waited in the quiet, as if his pain had a right to be slow. The mirror remained on the desk between them like a small, patient witness. Ethan Hawthorne did not look into it, but he did not order it removed. That alone changed the room. Clara felt it in the silence, in the way the rain softened against the library windows, in the way the Duke's hand rested near the silver handle without touching it. For a man who had commanded every reflection in his house to be destroyed, allowing one to remain was not a decision. It was a battle. You may leave the tray, he said at last. His voice had returned to its usual coldness, but something beneath it sounded worn rather than cruel. Clara folded the linen around the mirror again, not to hide it from him, but to protect it from the hard edge of morning. Yes, Your Grace. She turned toward the door with her carpetbag in hand. Miss Bennet. She stopped. Do you know why people preserve beautiful things? Clara looked back. He stood beside the cold fireplace, one shoulder angled away from the light, his scar half concealed by shadow. Because they fear losing them, she said. No, his mouth tightened. Because they fear what remains after beauty is gone. The words settled heavily, and though he seemed to regret speaking them, he did not take them back. His gaze shifted to the covered portrait above the mantel, its white cloth hanging like a funeral shroud. Before Ashford Lodge, I believed the world kinder than it was. That was my first vanity. Clara remained still. Outside, the wind dragged rain across the glass in long silver threads. Ethan's eyes did not leave the covered portrait. There was a storm that night. Worse than this. The roads were mud for miles, and half the guests had chosen to remain at the lodge until morning. Vivian Monroe was there. He spoke her name with careful emptiness, as though it belonged to a stranger in a newspaper column. She was to become Duchess of Hawthorne by winter. Clara's fingers loosened around the handle of her carpetbag. She had heard the name in servant whispers, always accompanied by lowered voices and glances toward the east wing. A lamp fell in the music room, Ethan continued. At least that is what the official account said. Curtains caught first, then the carpet near the pianoforte. There was smoke, confusion, foolish panic from people who had never been inconvenienced by anything more serious than a delayed carriage. Vivian was trapped beyond the music room doors. I reached her before the fire spread farther. He paused. The room seemed to hold its breath around him. No one needed to hear more than that. Clara understood the mercy of what he left unsaid. The story did not require harsh detail. The wound had already lived long enough. You saved her, she said softly. Ethan's expression did not change, but his hand closed around the edge of the mantel. I brought her out. For 3 weeks afterward, society called me noble. For 6 weeks, they sent flowers. By the 3rd month, the invitations stopped arriving. By the 4th, Vivian's letters stopped arriving as well. A faint, humorless breath left him. When I finally saw her again, she looked at me for less than a second before looking away. That was when I learned the difference between gratitude and devotion. Clara felt a quiet ache move through her chest. Not pity, recognition. She thought of her father standing in a courthouse hall in his worn black coat, while women he had once treated crossed the street to avoid greeting him. She thought of the doors that closed after a single accusation, the polite faces that became walls, the poverty that followed a ruined name like a shadow. People are often brave when suffering is dramatic, she said. They grow less brave when suffering asks them to stay. Ethan turned toward her then. Something in her answer had reached beyond curiosity. You speak as if you know. Clara lowered her eyes. She had not intended to bring her own sorrow into his library. Servants survived by being useful, not remembered. My father was a physician, she said. A good one. Better than the town deserved. Ethan waited. He failed to save a woman whose family required someone to blame. After that, every kindness he had ever given was forgotten. People who owed him their children's health would not meet his eyes. Mothers who had called him a blessing crossed the road. By the time truth no longer mattered, reputation had already done its work. Her voice did not break. That was what made it painful. Ethan studied her with new attention, as if the plain gray dress had hidden a grief as carefully covered as any portrait in Hawthorne Hall. And so you came here. And so I worked wherever work was offered, including a house where the master dismisses servants for speaking truth. Clara met his gaze. Yes, Your Grace. For the first time, his severity almost gave way, not to a smile, but to something quieter, more dangerous to a man who had lived behind anger. Respect. The clock on the mantel struck 7. Clara remembered her carpetbag, her dismissal, the narrow road beyond the gates. Ethan remembered it too. His eyes moved to the envelope of wages on the desk, then to the silver mirror beneath the linen. Mrs. Hale is short of hands in the household, he said. Clara stilled. Is she? Mr. Whitaker has also informed me that the north wing requires someone attentive. That sounds like a practical difficulty. It does. Rain whispered. Candlelight trembled. Ethan looked toward the window rather than at her. Practical difficulties should not be worsened by unnecessary departures. Clara's breath caught, but only barely. Am I to understand that I am no longer dismissed? You are to understand, he said, his voice clipped but not unkind, that your hour is extended. Clara lowered her head, hiding the small relief that warmed her face. Until when, Your Grace? Ethan's gaze returned to the covered mirror. Until I say otherwise. She curtsied, but before she left, she placed the silver hand mirror not in her bag, not in the drawer, but on the far edge of his desk, wrapped in linen and waiting. Ethan watched her go. Long after the door closed, he remained standing in the library, alone with the first beautiful thing he had allowed to survive the night. For 3 days, Hawthorne Hall did not speak of Clara Bennett's almost dismissal, yet every corridor seemed to know. Servants who had avoided her now watched with careful curiosity as she crossed the stone passages carrying clean linens, medicine trays, and coal scuttles too heavy for her narrow wrists. Mrs. Hale gave her no praise, but the old housekeeper placed an extra roll beside her soup at supper. Mr. Whitaker said nothing at all, which in that house was nearly kindness. The Duke remained in the West Library, receiving his meals, answering estate letters, and refusing all visitors. Yet each morning, the silver hand mirror stayed on the far edge of his desk, wrapped in linen, untouched but not banished. Clara noticed this because servants notice what others pretend not to see. On the 4th evening, a cold mist rose from the grounds and pressed itself against the windows until the world beyond Hawthorne Hall disappeared. Thomas Reed's fever had lessened, but Mrs. Hale discovered that the supply of willow bark and dried mint was nearly gone. The key to the old medicine cabinet, she said with a frown, had once been kept in the east wing, before that part of the house was closed. Then I will ask Mr. Whitaker, Clara said. Mrs. Hale's face tightened. No one asks for the east wing. The boy still needs medicine. The boy needs many things this house does not provide. Clara looked toward the servants' stair, where the walls darkened after the 3rd landing. Then perhaps it should begin providing one of them. Mrs. Hale caught her wrist, not harshly, but with fear. Child, there are doors in great houses that are not locked to keep servants out. They are locked to keep grief in. Clara gently freed her hand. Grief does not obey locks. By candlelight, she climbed the servants' stairs and crossed the narrow gallery toward the forbidden wing. The air changed before she reached it. It grew colder, not with weather, but with abandonment. A long runner, once crimson, lay dulled by dust. The windows were veiled. A bronze statue stood beneath a sheet, its shape like a waiting mourner. At the end of the corridor, 2 doors rose taller than the others, dark oak carved with hawthorn branches. They were not locked. That surprised her more than a lock would have. Clara pushed one open and entered a room where the past had not died, only been left without air. The East Wing study smelled of old paper, ash, and fading roses. Letters covered the writing desk in careful stacks, hundreds of them, some sealed, some opened, none sent. White cloths covered chairs, portraits, and what might have been a pianoforte near the window. On the mantel sat a pair of pearl hair combs in a glass case. Beside them lay a woman's glove, pale cream silk, its edge darkened by age and smoke. Clara stood very still. She knew at once that she had entered a wound, not a room. The candle shook in her hand. She moved to the cabinet against the far wall and found bottles labeled in neat ink: dried mint, feverfew, willow bark, lavender, camphor. Her fingers closed around what she needed, but as she turned, her sleeve brushed a stack of letters. One slipped free and fell open on the carpet. She did not mean to read it. Her eyes caught only one line before she could look away. I would have loved you forever, had the world not taught me to fear what you became. The room seemed to darken around those words. Then the door opened behind her. Put it down. Ethan Hawthorne stood at the threshold, and the quiet fury in his voice was worse than shouting. Clara lowered the letter at once. Your Grace, I came for medicine. You came where you were not permitted. Thomas needed willow bark. Then Thomas should have asked someone with permission to breathe near my dead memories. His words cut through the cold room, but Clara heard what trembled beneath them. Not cruelty. Panic dressed as command. Ethan crossed the room in 3 measured strides and took the letter from her hand. His fingers were steady, but his face had lost color. The scar along his cheek seemed sharper in the candlelight, not because it made him frightening, but because grief had pulled every line of him tight. Clara bowed her head. I should not have seen it. No, you should not have. He turned toward the desk, gathering the fallen letters as if restoring bones to a grave. This wing is closed for a reason. Because of Miss Monroe? The silence that followed was vast. Clara wished the question back the moment it left her lips, but truth, once spoken, did not return simply because it had stepped into pain. Ethan looked at her, and this time his anger was naked enough to reveal the hurt beneath it. Do not give her name gentleness. She spent it long ago. Clara held the medicine bottles close to her apron. I meant no gentleness for her. Then what did you mean? That a room left untouched for 3 years is not the same as a heart kept safe. His gaze hardened. You presume too much again. Yes, Your Grace. And still you continue. Only because I know what it is to leave a room exactly as sorrow made it, and call that survival. The answer stopped him. Rain tapped softly at the veiled windows. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan noticed the medicine in her hands, the reason she had risked his anger, the proof that she had not come to pry but to care for a feverish boy no one important would remember. His voice lowered. Take what you came for. Clara curtsied. Thank you. She moved toward the door, but paused beside the covered pianoforte. Your Grace. His eyes remained on the letters. Do not test my patience further. The East Wing does not feel haunted by a woman who left. Clara looked at the cold room, the sealed letters, the veiled windows. It feels haunted by the man you were before she did. Ethan did not answer. He could not. Clara left with the medicine, closing the door softly behind her. Inside the East Wing study, Ethan stood alone among the letters, the glove, the old dust, and the terrible realization that the servant girl had not touched his wound by accident. She had found the room where he buried it. By midnight, the medicine had done its quiet work. Thomas Reed slept beneath 2 blankets with his mended coat folded over the chair beside him, and the north wing, usually restless with drafts and servant footsteps, settled into a hush so deep that even the rain seemed to fall more carefully. Clara Bennett should have gone to her narrow bed beneath the eaves. Instead, she remained in the small workroom near the servants' stair, grinding dried mint with a mortar and pestle, preparing a tea missus. Hale insisted would calm the boys' chest by morning. The candle beside her had burned low. Wax gathered at its base like frozen tears. Her fingers smelled of herbs, soap, and old dust from the East Wing. She tried not to think of the letters. She tried not to think of the cream silk glove, or the sentence that had entered her mind despite her efforts to look away. I would have loved you forever, had the world not taught me to fear what you became. Some cruelties wore lace gloves. Some abandonments arrived with perfect handwriting. Clara knew better than to pity Duke Ethan Hawthorne in any simple way. Pity placed one person above another. What she felt was recognition, and recognition was far more dangerous. Near 1 o'clock, a sound broke through the corridor. Not a shout, not a crash. A single, sharp fall of something wooden against stone. Clara lifted her head. A second sound followed, lower, strained, quickly swallowed. She took the candle and stepped into the passage. The house seemed to lean inward around her. Far below, toward the west library, a line of light lay beneath the door. Clara descended without calling for help. She did not know why. Perhaps because servants learned the difference between danger and suffering. Perhaps because, after the East Wing, she understood that some doors must be opened gently or not at all. The library door stood ajar. Inside, the fire had burned down to red coals. A chair lay overturned near the desk, and several estate papers had scattered across the rug. Ethan Hawthorne stood by the cold window with one hand braced against the frame, his shoulders rigid, his breath uneven. The silver hand mirror rested on the desk, no longer wrapped in linen. He had not looked into it. He had turned it face down. Clara stopped at the threshold. "Your Grace." His voice came rough and low. "Leave." She did not move. "Are you unwell?" "I said leave. And I heard you." That made him turn. Candlelight touched the scar across his face, but what frightened Clara was not the scar. It was the exhaustion in his eyes, the look of a man who had been fighting a battle no one else could see and was ashamed to be found tired. "You have an extraordinary talent for disobedience," he said. "Only when obedience would be useless." His mouth tightened, but no rebuke followed. Clara noticed then the small line of red across his palm, where the edge of the overturned mirror frame must have caught him. It was slight, hardly more than a shallow cut, but his hand was clenched so tightly that it had not stopped bleeding. "Your hand," she said. "It is nothing. Then it will cost you little to let me bind it. Do not make a ritual of my injuries, Miss Bennet. I do not worship pain, Your Grace. I only know it worsens when neglected." The words hung between them. Slowly, as though surrendering something far larger than his hand, Ethan allowed her to approach. Clara set the candle on the desk, opened the small sewing basket she had carried from the workroom, and took out a clean strip of linen. His hand was large, cold, and tense in hers. She cleaned the cut with water from the carafe, then wrapped the cloth around his palm with careful turns. Neither spoke. The fire shifted softly behind them. Rain traced the windows in long dark lines. Clara felt the force of his stillness more than any anger. When she tied the linen, her fingers brushed the inside of his wrist. Ethan drew a breath as if startled by warmth. "Do not pity me," he said, though the command had lost its edge. Clara looked up. "I do not pity wounds that survive." His eyes locked on hers. Something in the room changed, not loudly, not suddenly, but with the delicate crack of ice beneath spring water. Clara lowered her gaze to finish the bandage, and as she withdrew her hand, her knuckles accidentally brushed the lower edge of his scar near his jaw. Ethan went utterly still. The contact lasted less than a second. A breath. A mistake. A mercy neither of them had asked for. Clara froze, afraid she had overstepped beyond forgiveness. "Forgive me," she whispered. But Ethan did not recoil. He did not command her out. His face had gone pale, yet his eyes were not angry. They were astonished. For 3 years, people had touched him with gloves, with distance, with medical necessity, or not at all. But Clara's accidental touch had carried no disgust, no flinch, no hidden prayer to escape him. It had landed softly on the part of him the world had treated as a warning. "You did not tremble," he said. Clara's voice was barely above the rain. "Neither did you." For a long moment, the Duke of Hawthorne Hall stood in his dark library with his wounded hand wrapped in plain linen, the mirror face down beside him, and a servant girl near enough to see the pain he had buried beneath command. Then, quietly, he turned the mirror over. He did not look into it. Not yet. But he let the silver catch the candlelight. The silver caught the candlelight, and for one suspended breath, Ethan Hawthorne seemed to stand at the edge of a door he had spent 3 years refusing to open. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor. Clara moved back at once, lowering her hands as propriety returned like a curtain dropped between them. Mr. Whitaker appeared at the library entrance, his face composed but unusually pale. "Your Grace," he said, bowing, "forgive the interruption." A carriage has arrived at the south portico. Ethan did not look away from the mirror immediately. At this hour? Yes, Your Grace. Send them to an inn. Mr. Whitaker hesitated. The caller gave a name. The room cooled before the name was spoken. Clara felt it in the Duke's posture, in the way his wrapped hand closed slowly at his side. Miss Vivian Monroe, the butler said. For a moment, even the rain seemed to stop against the windows. Ethan's expression became so still that it ceased to look human. Clara understood then that some names did not enter a room. They returned to it like smoke. She is not welcome, Ethan said. I informed her as much. And she replied that she carries a formal invitation from the Van der Luyens for tomorrow evening's charity ball in Albany, and that she will wait in the receiving room until Your Grace grants her 5 minutes. Ethan gave a short, cold breath that was almost a laugh. Charity. How exquisitely chosen. Clara lowered her gaze, but she could not stop remembering the cream silk glove, the line of handwriting, the kind of cruelty that excused itself as fear. Ethan reached for the mirror, then stopped before his fingers touched it. The gesture was so slight that only Clara saw the war inside it. Vivian Monroe had returned before he had even learned how to face himself. Have her carriage brought around, Ethan said. I will not receive her. Mr. Whitaker bowed. Very good, Your Grace. But before he could withdraw, another voice floated from the hall, soft, polished, and bright enough to cut. Still dismissing people before they enter, Ethan? Some habits are less charming with age. Vivian Monroe stepped into the doorway, as if Hawthorne Hall still belonged to the memory of her beauty. She wore traveling silk the color of pale blue ice, her fair hair arranged beneath a feathered hat, her gloves spotless despite the weather. Nothing about her seemed touched by rain, remorse, or time. Her eyes moved first to Ethan's scar, then away with practiced grace, almost quick enough to seem kind. Almost. Miss Monroe, Ethan said. No title, no warmth. Your servant was told to wait. I have waited 3 years. Her smile trembled in the exact measure required to appear wounded. Surely that earns me 5 minutes. Clara stepped farther into shadow, but Vivian saw her. Women like Vivian noticed servants the way cats noticed closed doors. I did not realize you had company. Ethan's voice sharpened. Miss Bennet is attending to household duties. At this hour? How devoted. The words were sweet, but Clara heard the small blade inside them. Ethan heard it too. Say what you came to say. Vivian crossed the room slowly, letting her gaze touch the stripped walls, the empty spaces where mirrors had once hung, the linen on the desk, the silver handle just visible beneath candlelight. The Van der Luyens asked me to deliver the invitation personally. They hope you will attend. Society has missed you. Society has a curious way of demonstrating affection. You cannot remain buried here forever. I was not aware you cared where I was buried. That struck. Vivian's lips parted, then closed. For one moment, the performance faltered. I was young, she said. I was frightened. Ethan looked at her then, fully, without turning his scar from the light. Clara saw the effort it cost him. Vivian saw the scar and did not flinch. But worse, she softened her face into pity. You must understand what it was like, she whispered. Everyone was watching. Everyone was talking. I did not know how to be brave enough for both of us. The words might have sounded like confession to someone who had never been abandoned. To Clara, they sounded like a mirror covered with lace. Ethan's jaw tightened. No, you knew precisely how to be brave for yourself. Vivian's eyes flicked to Clara again, colder now. And this girl teaches you courage. The silence that followed was dangerous in its quietness. Clara lowered her eyes, not from shame, but from discipline. Ethan took one step forward. This girl mended a feverish boy's coat after I dismissed her from service. This girl entered a forbidden wing to fetch medicine when others chose obedience over mercy. This girl has spoken more truth in 4 days than most drawing rooms manage in a season. Vivian's face lost a little of its color. How noble of her. Yes, Ethan said. It was. Clara's breath caught. No one in that room moved. Outside, the storm rolled beyond the windows, distant and low. Vivian placed the invitation on the desk beside the silver mirror. Come tomorrow, she said, her voice tighter now. Let them see you have not become what they whisper. Ethan looked down at the embossed card. The old fear moved through him, not of society, but of returning to the place where beauty had once been his passport and pity had become his sentence. Clara saw it. She saw his wrapped hand, the mirror, the scar, the invitation, the wound dressed as a ballroom. "Your Grace," she said softly, "a house without mirrors is still a house. But a man who lets others decide what he may face becomes their prisoner." Ethan did not answer. Vivian laughed under her breath. How poetic. Clara finally lifted her gaze. "No, Miss Monroe. Only practical." The Duke turned toward the desk. Slowly, he took the invitation. Vivian's expression brightened with victory too soon. Ethan held the card over the candle flame. The edge curled, darkened, then fell into ash without spectacle. "Tell the Van Derlens," he said, "that I will attend without needing your permission to exist." Vivian stared at him. Clara stood very still, and on the desk between them, the silver mirror shone brighter than it had all night. By the next evening, Hawthorne Hall had changed in ways too small for most eyes and too great for Clara Bennett to ignore. The mirrors were still gone from the walls, the portraits still turned or covered, the east wing still cold behind its carved doors, yet the house seemed to breathe differently. In the West Library, Duke Ethan Hawthorne stood before the fire while Mr. Whitaker adjusted the cuffs of his black evening coat with hands that did not quite hide their astonishment. The coat had been brushed, the boots polished, the silver cravat pin restored from a drawer where it had slept for years. Ethan had refused the fashionable high collar that would have concealed part of his scar. "If I am to be stared at," he said, fastening one glove over his bandaged palm, "let them work for nothing hidden." Mr. Whitaker bowed as if those words deserved ceremony. Clara stood near the doorway with the household staff, her gray servant's dress replaced by a clean black gown Mrs. Hale had lent her for attending duties at the ball. She was not a guest. She would not enter through the front hall or stand beneath chandeliers as an equal. Yet when Ethan turned and saw her holding his mother's silver mirror wrapped in dark velvet, something passed between them that no rule of rank could name. "Why have you brought that?" he asked. Clara held it carefully. "Because courage sometimes fails unless memory walks beside it." He looked at the bundle, then at her face. "And you believe I require courage from a hand mirror?" "No, Your Grace. I believe you require no permission from fear." The carriage ride to Albany took nearly an hour and a half beneath a moon veiled by winter cloud. The Vanderlyn mansion rose at the end of a long drive, its windows blazing gold against the dark Hudson Valley night. Carriages lined the gravel sweep. Music drifted from within, bright and careless, as if suffering had never been invited past the door. Ethan stepped down first. Conversations near the entrance softened, then thinned, then stopped. Clara followed with the other attendants, keeping several paces behind, the velvet-wrapped mirror held against her side. She felt the whispers before she understood them. "There he is. Hawthorne. I thought he never left that dreadful house. Is it true? Do not stare." Everyone stared. Ethan walked through the entrance hall without slowing. His scar was visible beneath the chandelier light, pale and solemn along his cheek, but Clara saw what the room did not. She saw the measured breath, the bandaged hand closing once, then opening. The man who had chosen to arrive, though every inch of polished marble asked him to retreat. Vivian Monroe waited near the ballroom arch, dressed in ivory silk, her beauty arranged like a weapon polished for public use. Around her stood 3 women and 2 gentlemen whose smiles faded when Ethan approached. "Your Grace," Vivian said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "how brave of you to come." The word brave landed like a feather dipped in poison. Ethan inclined his head. "Miss Monroe, I worried the lights might be uncomfortable after so long away from society." Clara, standing beyond the arch with the servants, felt heat rise beneath her collar. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but she saw the wound reopen behind his eyes. Vivian glanced toward a gilt mirror that hung beside the ballroom doors, enormous and cruelly bright. But perhaps returning to the world requires facing all parts of it. A few guests turned toward the mirror, then toward Ethan. The room waited. Not openly, not honestly. Society never looked hungry when it fed. Clara moved before caution could stop her. She crossed the threshold meant for attendance only, her black skirts whispering over the polished floor. A footman reached as if to halt her, but Mr. Whitaker, who had arrived behind her, gave one small shake of his head. Clara stopped beside the Duke and placed the velvet bundle on a narrow marble table beneath the chandelier. Vivian's eyes sharpened. How unusual. Does your servant now bring relics to balls? Clara unwrapped the silver mirror slowly. Gasps moved softly through the nearest guests when the engraved lilies caught the light. Ethan looked down at it, and all the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade until there was only candlelight, silver, and a memory of his mother telling a little boy to look himself in the eye. Clara did not raise the mirror toward his face. She laid it flat, reflecting only the chandelier above them. "This does not ask you to see what they see," she said softly, though the words carried in the hush. "Only to remember who loved you before they learned to judge you." Ethan's breath changed. Vivian's smile vanished. For a long moment, he stood between the great ballroom mirror and the small silver one, between the society that had reduced him to a scar and the memory that had once called him beloved. Then he lifted his eyes, not to his reflection, not to Vivian, but to the waiting room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice deep, formal, and terribly calm. "I have been absent long enough for rumor to become comfortable in my chair. Consider tonight my return." No one spoke. Ethan turned to Clara. "Miss Bennet, remain close." Vivian's face tightened. "Surely you do not mean to be attended publicly by a servant girl?" Ethan looked at her with a stillness more final than anger. "I mean to stand near the first person in this room who did not mistake pity for kindness." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of rearranged power. Clara lowered her eyes, but not before Ethan saw the brightness she refused to let fall. The orchestra, uncertain and obedient, began again. This time, when society looked at Duke Ethan Hawthorne, he did not turn away. The orchestra resumed with a trembling waltz, but the ballroom did not return to what it had been. Something invisible had shifted beneath the chandeliers. Conversation restarted in careful fragments. Fans opened and closed. Gentlemen cleared their throats, and women who had once spoken of Duke Ethan Hawthorne in lowered voices now watched him with the alertness people give to a man they have underestimated. Ethan did not smile. He did not soften for them. He simply stood beneath the gold light with his scar uncovered, his gloved hand resting near the small silver mirror on the marble table, and allowed the room to learn that his presence required no apology. Clara Bennet remained several steps behind him, exactly where a servant should stand, yet every eye knew she was not merely part of the household. She was the reason he had not turned away. Vivian Monroe understood it too. Her face stayed composed, but the delicate triumph she had worn all evening had thinned into something brittle. "You make a spectacle of yourself for sentiment," she said softly, stepping close enough that only Ethan and Clara could hear. "No," Ethan replied. "I made a prison of myself for shame. There is a difference." Vivian's lips parted, but no answer came quickly enough. Clara saw, with quiet sadness, that Vivian had expected the broken man she remembered, the one who would lower his gaze, turn his scar into shadow, and let the world mistake his silence for agreement. That man had entered the ballroom. He was not the man standing there now. Lord Van der Lyn, the elderly host, approached with cautious dignity and bowed. "Your Grace, Hawthorne Hall has been missed among our charitable councils. Your mother's foundation for widows still bears her name with honor." Ethan's hand tightened slightly at his side. "Then it is time I stopped leaving her work to memory." The old man's expression warmed with relief. "May I say, sir, Albany is better for your return." A few nearby guests murmured agreement. Some sincerely, some because power had turned and they wished to be standing on the correct side of it. Ethan heard both kinds and trusted neither. Yet he inclined his head with the grace he had once been famous for, and Clara saw the echo of the man from the portraits, not restored, not replaced, but standing beside the wounded man rather than buried beneath him. Later, when the music deepened and couples moved across the floor in slow circles, Ethan stepped away from the crowd and stood before the great gilt mirror beside the ballroom doors. Clara followed only far enough to remain useful, then stopped. This was not a distance she could cross for him. The mirror reflected everything society valued: silk, jewels, chandeliers, white gloves, perfect faces arranged into perfect expressions. Then it reflected Ethan, the scar, the silver at his temple, the guarded eyes, the bandage beneath his glove. For one terrible moment, his breath caught. Clara saw it. So did no one else. She held the small mirror against her heart, still wrapped partly in velvet, and waited. Ethan looked at the man in the glass. Not quickly, not bravely in the way ballads used the word. He looked as a man might step onto a frozen lake, knowing it could break beneath him and choosing the step anyway. The scar did not vanish. The old face did not return. Vivian's abandonment did not undo itself. The years inside Hawthorne Hall did not dissolve beneath chandelier light. But something changed in his eyes. He stopped searching for the man he had lost and saw, perhaps for the first time, the man who had endured. "Miss Bennet," he said without turning. Clara came forward, careful, quiet. "Yes, Your Grace. My mother once told me that a gentleman must look himself in the eye before he looks upon the world." His voice was low, nearly hidden beneath the waltz. I thought she meant confidence. Clara looked at his reflection beside hers. Noble black and servant black, power and poverty, both softened by the same candlelight. What do you think she meant now? Ethan's gaze met his own in the mirror, and this time he did not flinch. Truth. The words settled between them like a vow. Behind them, Vivian left the ballroom without farewell. No one stopped her. Her departure passed through society like a page turned in a book no one wished to admit they had been reading. Ethan did not watch her go. He turned instead to the small mirror Clara carried. "May I?" he asked. She placed it in his uninjured hand. Their fingers did not linger, yet the brief exchange carried more tenderness than all the polished compliments in the room. Ethan lifted the silver mirror, the lilies and initials bright beneath the chandeliers. For a heartbeat, he saw only the engraving. E, H, and M, H. A mother's love, a son's return. Then he tilted it slightly and looked. Clara saw his face change. Not into happiness. That would have been too simple, too shallow for a wound so old. It changed into acceptance, and acceptance had a quieter beauty. "You were the first person," he said, still looking into the glass, "who did not ask me to become who I was." Clara's voice was gentle. "I never met who you were." At last, he looked at her. "No." His scar caught the light. His eyes did too. "You met who remained." The ride back to Hawthorne Hall began near midnight, beneath a sky cleared by wind. Frost silvered the fields for miles, and the carriage lamps trembled over the road like small captured stars. Neither Ethan nor Clara spoke for a long while. No words were needed to dress what had happened. By the time the house rose from the dark, its windows no longer looked like blind eyes. They looked like rooms waiting to be opened. At the entrance hall, Ethan paused where the mirrors had once been carried out. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "tomorrow, have the ballroom uncovered." The butler's face nearly broke with feeling. "Yes, Your Grace." Ethan looked toward Clara, and the east wing windows opened. Clara lowered her eyes to hide the warmth there. "It will be a cold morning. Then we will light more fires." He walked to the West Library alone after that, but not as he had walked before. Clara saw the difference in his shoulders, in the steadiness of his steps, in the way he did not avoid the dark glass of the rain-washed windows. On his desk, he placed his mother's silver mirror upright for the first time in 3 years. It caught the firelight and gave it back, not perfectly, not without shadows, but honestly. And in Hawthorne Hall, where grief had once been locked behind every covered door, mourning waited with quiet patience. Because some wounds do not vanish, they become bearable when touched by hands that do not tremble.